On October 8, 1871, two catastrophes of almost apocalyptic proportions unfolded at the same time in the US, just a few hundred miles from one another. These raged simultaneously, unbeknownst to the people involved, and one would go on to be the deadliest in American history, while the other would be one of the most destructive, bringing an entire city to its knees. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The 1870s were a time of great transformation for the United States. The Civil War had just ended 6 years earlier, and much of the nation was rebuilding during the Reconstruction era. And while a new normal was being established as part of that process, particularly in the American South, something just as defining was happening in the Midwest. Rapid industrialization, economic expansion, and significant technological advancements were driving an upsurge in the region as job opportunities caused the population to boom. This was no more true than in Chicago, which was establishing itself as a national symbol of progress. In 1850, the city was home to just 30,000 residents, but just 20 years later, its population was pushing close to 300,000 people, as immigrants flocked from all over to scoop up the surplus of jobs that resulted from industrial and commercial growth. Its strategic location near Lake Michigan turned Chicago into a hub for railroads and trade. The new railroad system crisscrossed the city, establishing it as the largest interchange in the country and its most important processing center for raw materials. Public transportation was also cheap and helped expand the city's border to what it is today at 234 square miles or 606 square kilometers, and still the third largest city in the United States. About 220 miles or 550 kilometers to the north of Chicago as the crow flies, the city of Peshtigo, Wisconsin in the early 1870s was a stark contrast in terms of size and population, but it also saw its own share of rapid growth. Before Peshtigo was established in 1838, northern Wisconsin was so densely forested that it was often said that a squirrel could travel the entire region without ever touching the ground. As you might expect, this made it an attractive area for lumber, railroad, and farming industries, and by 1871, Peshtigo was home to the largest woodenware factory in the world and one of the biggest sawmills in the country. Timber was essentially the lifeblood of Peshtigo, fueling its economy as it supplied wood to America's rapidly expanding cities, including Chicago. And just like Chicago, Peshtigo saw an influx of immigrants in search of work, which quickly increased its population to around 2,000 people. The sudden expansion of the two cities, despite their size differences, caused the same set of circumstances to take shape in both places. People settling in needed places to live, and businesses needed to be built, and it all had to be done fast. As both cities grew, they became more compact, with homes and businesses being constructed almost on top of one another. And while stone, steel, brick, and concrete were coming into fashion as building materials at the time, wood was still king. It was more readily available, and more importantly, it was cheaper to use, so both cities were essentially built with it from the ground up. Everything from houses and factories to roads, sidewalks, and even bridges were made of wood. Unfortunately, neither of these cities would understand the risk this created until one fateful day on October 8, 1871. The events that began that day were set in motion at least a year earlier, as the fall and winter of 1870 were unusually dry in the Midwest. That trend continued into the spring of 1871, and the entire region was suffering from severe drought conditions before summer arrived to offer no relief at all. Between July 7th and October 8th, Chicago received only 3.5 inches or 9 centimeters of precipitation, making it the second driest period on record. As the calendar moved toward the fall that year, the hope was that it would be a particularly wet one, but if September was any indication, that wouldn't be the case. Less than an inch of rain fell all month, and not a single drop fell between September 29th and October 8th. To make matters even worse, temperatures were unseasonably hot and winds were unusually high on more days than not. In fact, early October saw temperatures soar beyond 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26.7 Celsius, and conditions were just right on October 8th for the two densely populated cities constructed of wood to be devastated. October 8th started off like any other Sunday in Peshtigo. Many families attended church services and gathered together for a day of rest, but that wasn't the case for some of its residents. Those in the lumber and railroad industries worked continuously, and a big part of that operation was the process of clearing land. Lumberjacks were constantly sawing down trees and transporting them to the sawmill, but this would leave behind all sorts of debris like branches and leaves. Rather than load all of that up and dump it elsewhere, it was easier and more economical to pile up what was left behind on site and set the mounds of debris on fire. This process was called slash and burn, and it was such a common practice that Peshtigo citizens had grown accustomed to being surrounded by a smoky haze every day. However, there was just something different about the fires burning that Sunday that caught the attention of a few residents. As Reverend Peter Pernin readied himself to travel to the nearby city of Marinette to lead an evening service, he was approached by several parishioners who had grown concerned by the conditions that afternoon. The wind had been increasing in intensity, and the smoke that billowed on the city's outskirts had grown thicker throughout the day, which had some of them spooked. Reverend Peter listened to their pleas that he remain a Peshtigo, and while he wasn't necessarily that concerned himself, he saw this as a sign from God that he shouldn't travel as planned. Either way though, the steamboat that was scheduled to take him to Marinette wasn't able to land due to the howling wind anyway, so it was almost like Reverend Peter was destined to stay put. Around 7 o'clock that evening, he was walking the streets with an elderly widow and couldn't help but notice that the wind was now coming in much stronger gusts. He stopped for a moment and looked in the direction the wind was blowing in from and saw a dense cloud of smoke advancing from the west, which again wasn't all that unusual considering Peshtigo's surroundings, but it was the intense and expansive red glow at the bottom of the cloud that gravely troubled the Reverend. Hundreds of miles away, darkness had fallen in Chicago when Daniel Sullivan exited his home and sat down on his porch. Finally, the high temperatures that day were starting to cool, which was made all the more refreshing by the winds that had moved into the city and kept growing in force. Directly across the street from Daniel's house was the property of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary, which included a house and a barn, and as he stared at them, something caught his attention. Some sort of red and orange glow had manifested near the barn, and within moments, Daniel saw flames shooting out of the structure. He then leapt to his feet and shouted fire before racing to the barn and entering it to free the cows and the calf inside. In just a matter of seconds, DeKoven Street on Chicago's west side was starting to fill with people who heard Daniel's shouts. Just a few blocks away at the city courthouse, several watchmen from the fire department were relaxing at their post in the building's watchtower. Because of the city's layout and the materials used to construct many of its buildings, fires were a rather common occurrence in Chicago, but in the days preceding October 8th, the city's 185 firefighters had been run ragged by frequent calls. In fact, just the night before, they had fought off the city's worst fire in nearly 3 years, which destroyed a mill about 8 blocks away from the O'Leary property. The men desperately needed a break that would certainly not come that night. As a watchman named Matthias Schaefer lazily scanned the city's many blocks from his perch in the tower, his attention was grabbed by the flames that were now shooting toward the sky from the barn on DeKoven Street. At almost the exact same time, an alarm had been sent from the area near the fire, but it never registered at the courthouse. Some confusion on the part of Matthias then resulted in firefighters being sent to the wrong area, and by the time this was noticed and corrected, winds gusting to 60 miles an hour or 95.5 kilometers per hour had caused the flames to hop to other buildings. And soon, the entire city block was an inferno. As the exhausted and depleted firefighters in Chicago struggled to form an organized effort to fight the growing inferno, Reverend Peter monitored the situation in Peshtigo. Looking back toward the west in the foreboding red glow, he suddenly noticed a muffled roar in the air. He had never been able to hear the fires before from the city, and so he quickly heeded this as a warning sign. In his small garden, he started hastily digging a trench with his pickaxe where he planned to bury some of his belongings, knowing in his heart that a disaster was on the way to the city. By the time the trench was complete, voices of concerned citizens had started to intermix with the increasing roar, and a servant appeared in the garden to warn the Reverend that something terrible was on its way. Before he'd leave though, he needed to rescue some items that were seen as priceless to his faith, including the tabernacle and the chalice that were kept in the chapel. He then rushed inside and grabbed the tabernacle before running it out to his wagon and returning to the chapel to find the chalice. Just as he did, he heard what sounded like the explosion of a powder keg and saw a cloud of sparks burst through the doorway. He then rushed out of the church to find the streets in full panic. Just as he went to open the front gate to climb aboard his wagon, a hurricane-force wind blew through the city, carrying flaming boards from crumbling houses and the fence that surrounded the church. The wind also threw dust and hot ash into the air, making it almost impossible to breathe and see. In addition to that, there was also superheated air that burned the lungs of those frantically trying to escape the city, which was by then completely ablaze. While the Reverend was attempting to retrieve the chalice inside the church, the loud noise he heard was actually a sheet of fire shooting out of the forest that consumed everything in its path. All of Peshtigo was by then on fire as he struggled to grab onto his wagon, and the terrifying thought crossed his mind that he was already too late. To the south, as the fire spread through Chicago's west side, the southwest winds carried the flames from building to building, quickly overwhelming the city's firefighters. Based on the direction the fire was traveling, however, there was hope among them that the south branch of the Chicago River and a previously burned area of land might be enough to bring the blaze to an end as it ran out of material to burn. Thanks to extremely high wind gusts though, firemen would watch as that hope was crushed around 11:30 p.m. Along the opposite side of the river were lumber yards, warehouses, and coal stores, which were showered with red glowing embers. The high winds just picked up the heat from the fire and pushed it across the river, creating an area of superheated air that caused structures to literally burst into flames, including the Southside Gasworks. This meant the fire had jumped the river and there was now nothing in its path except more homes, buildings, and factories for it to consume. Around midnight, Chicago Mayor Roswell B. Mason rushed through the streets to his office at the courthouse. Although it would only be for a brief time, this served as a command post for city officials to monitor the fire and issue orders. He then reached out to other cities by telegraph to request any assistance they could offer, but when the fire had spread to the vicinity of the courthouse, he knew the city was beyond help. It was approaching 1:30 on the morning of October 9th when the building caught fire and the mayor ordered its evacuation. Policemen then rushed to the basement where the city jail was located to free all the prisoners before it was every man for himself to get out of the courthouse alive. The fire watchmen, including Matthias, barely escaped the courthouse tower before the massive bell housed inside it came crashing down as the structure burned. This noise was apparently so loud that it was heard more than a mile away. By then, Chicago was quite literally in complete chaos as the fire raced in a northwesterly direction, engulfing the city center. Thousands of people were in the streets by then, many of whom began as spectators before the immense danger of the situation was realized. The fire moved so fast that any sense of safety within its path vanished almost instantly, sending citizens racing toward the North Division. And despite the completely out of control inferno at this point, firefighters tried valiantly to slow or even halt the fire's progress, but they proved no match for the blaze. Nevertheless, they kept trying, but by 3:30 a.m., these efforts would be brought to an abrupt and tragic stop. Located on Chicago Avenue was the city's waterworks and pumping station. After the fire had leapt the banks of the river, it raced towards the station and a piece of burning lumber fell right onto its roof. After that, it only took a few minutes for the entire building to be fully engulfed by flames, completely disabling the pump and causing the city's water mains to run dry. Chicago was then entirely at the mercy of the fire. Back to the north, as flaming Peshtigo buildings surrounded him, Reverend Peter desperately pulled his wagon with all possible speed to put distance between himself and the fire. The simple acts of seeing and breathing were getting more and more difficult as dust and sparks continued to fill the air. Still, he did his best to guide the wagon through the panicked streets as Peshtigo residents fled in all directions. Meanwhile, the fire crackled around him at a volume he had never experienced before as chimneys crumbled and the intense winds uprooted trees. When he arrived at the bridge over the Peshtigo River, the Reverend was met with the terrifying sight of the wooden overpass already burning away, with people, cattle, and vehicles urgently trying to cross. The bridge was so packed and there was so much confusion that no progress could be made in either direction. People were hysterical as they crushed against one another in hopes of fleeing the burning city, and in the end, some made it, but many more did not. The Reverend saw his best hope of survival in the river itself, so finding a clearing along the Peshtigo River banks away from the bridge, he guided his wagon into the frigid water. As far as his eyes could see, the bank was lined with citizens in utter shock, almost frozen in fear and helpless to save themselves. Once his wagon was safely in the river, Reverend Peter looked to the people on both sides of him and pushed one of them in before grabbing the other and dragging him deeper into the water. Moments later, he could hear splashes all around him as others followed his lead and sought refuge in the river. When the water level was up to his neck, the Reverend felt a brief sense of safety that was quickly washed away by the intensifying heat that was being carried by high winds. As this wind blew in heavy gusts, those in the river would either have to cover their heads with a wet cloth or completely submerge themselves to keep from being burned. And soon, the roar of the fire turned into a sound more reminiscent of a train speeding right toward them. Looking back toward the city in the direction of the noise, Reverend Peter and those who were gathering in and near the river could barely believe what they were seeing. Stretching into the sky was a large spinning tube of fire. It was like hell itself had conjured up its own tornado and set it loose on Peshtigo. Back to the south, terrified Chicago residents were awestruck by the same sight as its own fire-wrapped tornado formed and began moving through the city. This was an otherworldly thing to witness, but there is a completely natural explanation for these twister-like spires that reach into the clouds. Chicago and Peshtigo were being ravaged by a meteorological phenomenon known as a fire whirl. The two respective fires produced so much heat that it rose skyward and mixed with the cooler air higher above the cities. As this occurred, the air started to spin and swirl, not unlike a tornado would. And these fire whirls were unimaginably destructive to both communities as they sent flaming debris into the night sky before depositing it wherever the wind would take it. This then caused the fire to jump the Chicago River a second time, leading to a railroad car full of kerosene to explode as the fire raged northward. As the sun rose on that Monday morning, Chicago continued to burn. The city's North Division was decimated by the flames, and by noon, the fire had reached North Avenue and continued in excess of another mile. But just after the sunset on the still blazing city that evening, something unexpected happened. It finally started to rain. It was Chicago's first precipitation in more than 10 days, and it continued into Tuesday, October 10th. That morning, the last flames were put out as rainfall and unbuilt lots on the north side of the city came together to end the rampage. The fire in Peshtigo, meanwhile, came to a conclusion much earlier as it burned itself out in the early morning hours of October 9th, but that wasn't the result of assistance from the rain. There was simply nothing left in the city for the fire to consume. Peshtigo had burned to the ground as if it never existed in the first place. Reverend Peter and many Peshtigo residents spent more than 5 hours in the cold river in hopes of escaping the fire, only for some to die of hypothermia. The days and weeks that followed both fires slowly revealed a picture of just how destructive each was. In Chicago, it would be days before anyone could enter these smoldering parts of the city because it was still just too hot. Even as it became safer to venture into the areas that were decimated, it was so hot that businessmen hoping to retrieve valuables from their fireproof safes could only watch as their money burst into flames the moment it was exposed to outside air. The Great Chicago Fire, as it's now known, that began as a barn blaze on Coven Street, wiped out an area of 6.4 kilometers long and 1.2 kilometers wide. The ruins included around 17,450 buildings, 117 kilometers of roads, and 193 kilometers of sidewalks. And no area was hit harder than the city's North Division. Of the 13,800 buildings that were located there, just 500 were left, thrusting around 75,000 citizens into homelessness. In total, 1/3 of the city's buildings were reduced to rubble, 1/3 of its residents lost their homes, and the cost of the disaster came out to 1/3 of the city's entire valuation. The death toll of the Great Chicago Fire is also the source of some debate, but it's generally accepted that around 300 people were killed during the blaze. The county coroner at the time concluded that an accurate death count would be impossible as some people drowned in the river while others were completely incinerated. Meanwhile, the human cost of the Peshtigo fire is almost beyond belief. Of the 2,000 permanent residents, at least 1,100 died. Some estimates even place that number closer to 2,500 deaths, which accounts for the visitors in the city at the time the fire burst out in the forest. As a result, it still tops the list of the deadliest fires in recorded US history. And while it was a significantly shorter event than the Great Chicago Fire, the Peshtigo Fire was no less catastrophic. In the end, about 1.2 million acres of land was scorched, and the cost of the disaster came in just below that of Chicago's. However, Reverend Peter would survive both the fire and the frigid water that night. In the aftermath, it was determined that the Peshtigo Fire began as several slash and burn fires merged into one as a result of the severe drought conditions and the extremely strong winds on October 8th. On the other hand, how exactly the Great Chicago Fire started isn't so easy to explain. This is part of the story that's reached a sort of legendary status, as it's commonly believed that the fire was the result of one of the cows in the O'Leary barn kicking over a lantern. The truth is, though, that the fire's origin will likely never be known, as the blaze completely destroyed every piece of evidence that could have helped experts come to a conclusion. In the void of this uncertainty, many stories have been put forward, like for example, one account says that a group of men were gambling inside the barn when one of them carelessly knocked over a lantern. Another concludes that it was purposely set by vandals. Spontaneous combustion has also been put forth as a possibility considering the conditions that dry and the large stores of dry straw in the barn. But unfortunately, again, the real cause will likely never be known. In the wake of the destruction, Chicago rebuilt itself quickly and efficiently with new laws that required buildings to be constructed of fireproof materials like brick and stone. Because these materials were more expensive than wood, though, many of the city's lower and middle class residents couldn't afford to rebuild. Many couldn't even afford to be covered by fire insurance in the first place, but even those who had coverage were out of luck as the fire destroyed many insurance companies, turning the policies stored in those buildings into ash. As a result, thousands fled the city to start new lives, but still many more moved in. By 1880, Chicago's population had reached 500,000 people, and it was well on its way to re-establishing itself as one of the country's most economically important cities. Peshtigo, on the other hand, having been completely razed by the fire, struggled to get back on its feet, but residents and businesses alike didn't abandon the city. The woodenware factory was rebuilt, and many other companies followed that lead. It would take the better part of 10 years, but by 1881, the city had risen from its ashes. Reverend Peter's Church was one of the first buildings reconstructed in the aftermath of the fire, and it still stands in the city today. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. In case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, And if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.